equity deals in the seed stage as Series A light, because you get a package of enhanced rights just like you would in a Series A deal, but it's sort of stripped down to what you'd expect to see in a typical Series A deal. So what you would see in a Series C round is a non-participating liquidation preference. So there are two concepts here. There's liquidation preference, which means that on a sale of the company, the investor gets first dollars out. So for example, you're investing $1 million into a company and the company is then sold for only $900,000. The investor will get the entire $900,000 and the founders get nothing. Imagine another scenario, you invest the same $1 million and now the company is sold for $1.5 million. Well, the investor has his liquidation preference usually of 1x, 1 times what he's invested. So he gets the first $1 million out, but what about the balance, $500,000? What happens with that? Well, that depends on whether it's participating or non-participating. So if it's participating after the investor gets his liquidation preference, in my example, it's $1 million. The investor would participate with the preferred on an as-converted basis. So in the Series A deals, in the Series C deals, the liquidation preference is non-participating. He will not participate. He gets his liquidation preference, or he converts. He's got to make that choice, whatever puts him in a better position. The Series C investor gets board representation, usually the first point in a startup's life where he brings in outside investors. It's really a good idea. A lawyer is talking about what makes a company fundable. Founders usually don't know how to make their company VC investable. So the outside investors coming in and serving on the board will help the company become VC investable. You get a package of reps and warranties, not as robust as you would in a Series C. You get protective provisions. These are vetoes, both at the board level and the stockholder level. Again, they're stripped down from what you see in a Series C. So usually you see things like a veto. These are all vetoes over major decisions. So usually at the Series C level, you would see a veto over charter amendments and major loans. They always get preemptive rights, which is not controversial. Usually founders view it as something good for the company. If the existing stockholders want to buy their pro rata share of a subsequent round, they get information rights. Usually these companies at the very early stages, they're not 100% GAAP compliant or audited financials. So you have to negotiate for some flow of information. And then you get a drag-along right, which is very often, when it comes time to sell the company, the buyer of the company will insist on some threshold of acceptance, some threshold of voting. Sometimes it's 100%. You want to be able to drag along recalcitrant shareholders. So when I said that a Series C round is like Series A light, so you have to ask, well, what's missing? What would you find in the Series A deal that you wouldn't find in a Series C? For one thing, anti-dilution protection. This refers to generally a situation where if the next round is priced at a valuation below the round that the Series C investor invested in, the Series C investor would be protected from economic dilution, usually by an adjustment of his conversion, his rate of conversion. In a Series C, you don't get preferred dividends. You would also not get registration rights. So when you negotiate a deal with an outside investor, you always have to think of your exit strategy. Part of your exit strategy would be a registration right, the right to require the company to carry your shares in your registration with the SEC so you can sell them into the public markets, either on a piggyback basis, where you piggyback on a registration statement the company underlies bond, or what's called a demand right. the protective provisions aren't as robust as in a Series A round. You don't get co-sale rights or the right to tag along, which is a right usually in the hands of a minority shareholder to tag along with the sale by a majority shareholder of his shares to a buyer. And you don't get legal opinions in a Series C round. So let's shift to equity crowdfunding. And again, as I mentioned earlier, equity crowdfunding refers less to the terms of the transaction, the economic terms, and more to the manner of the offering and the legal requirements for being able to bring that offering to market. And so, if you think of crowdfunding, I mean, crowdfunding, everybody, I think, understands that it's generally characterized by raising funds from lots and lots of people, each person investing small or contributing a small amount. In terms of equity crowdfunding, you can think of it as the internet coming to the capital formation industry. So what happens when the internet comes to any industry? Think about the publishing industry, the travel industry, the music industry, and by and large, the retail industry. What happens is disintermediation. You have buyers and sellers connecting directly, intermediaries getting marginalized, prices come down, the market becomes much more efficient. In the capital formation industry, the market, the intermediaries in the market are the investment banks, the finders, the placement agents, the VCs. This is the first time in history that buyers and sellers can connect directly through the internet. The roots of equity crowdfunding are in rewards-based crowdfunding. Reward-based crowdfunding is not an issue for the securities laws because you're not issuing stock, you're issuing like a t-shirt or an advanced copy of the book. And it originated from two perceived needs. One is that early stage companies were having a very difficult time accessing capital. And the flip side of that is that individual investors, by and large, non-accredited investors, by the way, an accredited investor, in the case of an individual, is anybody who meets either an income test or a net worth test. The income test is that you earn $200,000 in each of the last 2 years with a reasonable expectation of earning the same in the current year, or together with your spouse, $300,000 in each of the last 2 years with a reasonable expectation of earning the same in the current year. The reason for the difficulty in accessing capital, or difficulty in, from the investor's perspective, finding investment opportunities, was a legal impediment that up until a couple of years ago prevented people from being able to invest in these companies and from companies being able to reach non-accredited investors. And that's the prohibition on general solicitation and advertising. Basically a flat-out prohibition if you're engaged in a private offering. If you're not registering that offering to the SEC, you're not engaged in general advertising or solicitation. There was a huge chorus of criticism of this leading up to 2012 when Congress passed the Jobs Act. Now, the Jobs Act is not what it sounds like. It's not a piece of legislation to create jobs, at least not directly, but it was an election year with high unemployment. So they came up with an acronym that makes it sound like it's going to create jobs, and it's really an acronym for the Jumpstart Our Business Startup Act. And it had several different features in it. It's basically an amalgamation of several separate, independent capital formation reform initiatives. 3 of them dealt with what can be called crowdfunding. Now, Title III, the non-accredited investor crowdfunding, that's what people think of as crowdfunding. But Title II is also crowdfunding in the sense that you can now engage in general solicitation. And Title IV So the reform of so-called Reg A is also crowdfunding because it's sort of like a mini IPO. We'll get into each one of these three to balance the presentation. Whatever I have left, whatever Larry will give me. So accredited investor crowdfunding under Title II of the Jobs Act was a reform of old Rule 506. Rule 506 by far is the most prevalent private offering exemption. 90% of private offerings are done under Rule 506, and there's a very simple reason for it, or reasons, and that's you can raise an unlimited amount of money, and you can do so through sales to an unlimited number of accredited investors, plus up to 35 non-accredited investors. But as a practical matter, all private offerings under Rule 506 try to sell only to accredited investors. Why? The number one reason is if you only sell to accredited investors, you do not have to follow the specific mandated disclosure requirements under Reg D. So Reg D is what Rule 506 is part of. It's a safe harbor exemption. Safe harbor means that if you follow the specific rules in that regulation, you have the comfort of knowing that you satisfy the exemption. The one major obstacle, one major hurdle to capital raising in Rule 506 historically was what I mentioned earlier, and that was the prohibition on general solicitation or advertising. And that meant that you basically were limited to selling securities to only people that you had a pre-existing relationship with. Now think about that. Think of how limiting that is. And there are cute ways, lawyers like Lori, me, other securities lawyers have found a way to get around that by sort of piggybacking on pre-existing relationships that key people in the enterprise have, like your board or your investment banker may have. But by and large, it was very limited. There's other advantages of a 506 offering were that you only needed to do a notice filing with the SEC. You did not have to go through a merit review in the states, which is a huge advantage. And again, the basic disadvantage was the ban on general solicitation. So the Jobs Act came in and essentially lifted the ban on general solicitation in 506 with we call now the 506C offering. So let's jump to non-accredited crowdfunding. That's a little misleading. It doesn't mean that you can only sell to non-accredited shareholders. It means you can sell to everybody, including non-accredited shareholders. So what we're talking about here is small offerings. Many investors invest in small amounts. That was the idea here. The SEC proposed rules in October of 2013, but hasn't issued final rules yet. So you cannot engage in a Title III crowdfunding transaction yet. There are two major advantages of the proposed rules here. One is that it's covered security, which means that state law is preempted, which is a tremendous advantage. Otherwise, you have to go through a merit review in every state where you want to offer the securities. And secondly, is that the purchasers are not counted towards the threshold where you have to register with the SEC. So I'm going to have to jump through because I'm now over my time limit. So I'll jump through to the last leg of crowdfunding under the Jobs Act, which is a reform of Regulation A. So Regulation A was known as a mini public offering. You can, under the old Reg A, you can raise up to $5 million with a streamlined SEC filing. But the problem was that it was rarely used. It was rarely used because of the requirement to go through a merit review process with every state in which you wanted to sell securities. That's incredibly debilitating. It doesn't matter what the dollar amount would have been. People just stopped doing it. In fact, 2 years ago, there were only 8 Reg A deals, raising $34 million. Compare that to the 7,700 Reg D deals that raised $7 billion in the same year. So Reg A Plus was actually adopted last month, and it was supposed to go into effect 60 days after it was published in the Federal Register. If you read my blog, you would know that Yesterday, it was published in the Federal Register, which means that it goes effective in 60 days on June 19th. But the highlights of this new crowdfunding exemption is, number one, blue sky preemption. Most issuers under Reg A+, which is the way it's being referred to, can go through their offering without having to go through a review process in every state. You have enhanced test the waters. You can go out and take the temperature of potential investors. This is an enormous advantage because if there's not enough interest, you can save the money of having to engage in an offering if you know in advance that the investors are just not going to buy. There's scale disclosure, so you could actually file a confidential filing with the SEC, go through the review process with the SEC before you decide whether or not you want to go public with this. And then there's modified reporting on an ongoing basis. Instead of 4 times a year, which is what most public companies have to do, it's only semi-annual reporting. It does this through 2 tiers. Tier 1 is up to $20 million. Tier 2 has